Good evening po. Okay, good evening po. Oops, sorry. Medyo madilim. Hopefully that's much better. Okay. Hi, good evening. Thank you po for being here. Welcome to the Noche session for, actually this is for the month of March, but because of some movements we had to push it to the second week of April because last week was Holy Week. That's why, I mean, that also explains why this is our topic, because this was supposed to be for March and in celebration of Women's Month. Uh, so again, for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, Noche is part of the year-long celebration of the philosophy department for our decade as an independent department in the Faculty of Arts and Letters. And for each session, we are highlighting different articles from different thinkers representative of the five research thrusts of the department. For this evening, we are going to tackle Nancy Fraser's "What's Critical About Critical Theory: The Case of Habermas and Gender." Perhaps just to give an overview or just to give us an idea of Nancy Fraser, let me just read this very short thing, of course, from the internet. So Nancy Fraser is a professor of political and social science and professor of philosophy at the New School in New York City. Um, she holds honorary doctoral degrees from four universities in three countries, and she won the 2010 Alfred Schutz Prize in Social Philosophy from the APA, the American Philosophical Association. And she is the president of the American Philosophical Association Eastern Division. I think most of us would associate Nancy Fraser to writings on feminism, on critical theory, and social form of social critique. That's why it's also nice to read an essay from her, especially since she's still alive. I mean, it's nice to read works of people who are still alive instead of all those who have gone before us. Okay, to begin, maybe it would be nice to just point out, as I mentioned in my email. Let me just start sharing. Okay. Uh, this essay begins with this, and perhaps it would start our discussion. So, to my mind, no one has yet improved on Marx's 1843 definition of critical theory as the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. Uh, the struggles and wishes of the age, well, how I understand it, especially in light of what she wants to do here, what she does in this essay, is to provide how uh, a critical theory of society or writings along those lines would seek to to expose to an extent the struggles of a particular age. And what Nancy Fraser is trying to do here is to point certain errors or certain lacks in Habermas's view of society as what he presents in the communicative action, uh, for obvious reasons of its ungendered assumption of society. So the way Habermas shows it is that it's a a theory based on communicative action, and then you have those different factors. But what Nancy Fraser tries to do to us is that, well, for critical theory to be indeed critical, I mean, in the case of Habermas, uh, he must, or we, maybe it's better to just say we must clarify what are the struggles of our current age. At least that's my take of that passage. However, there is, according to this definition, an important political difference. A critical social theory frames its research program and its conceptual framework with an eye to the aims and activities of those oppositional social movements with which it has a partisan, though not uncritical identification. The questions it asks and the models it designs are informed by that identification and interest. Thus, for example, if struggles contesting the subordination of women figured among the most significant of a given age, then a critical social theory for that time would aim, among other things, to shed light on the character and basis of such subordination. It would employ categories and explanatory models that revealed rather than occluded relations of male dominance and female subordination. And most of us have gone through the essay. I presume we have seen how Nancy Fraser is able to point that out. So when Habermas, just to again give an overview, just when Habermas talks about communicative action, or when he talks about enlightenment, when he talks about modernization, uh, it's let's say like that the thing that he just does not talk about, which is in fact inherently pathological. How there is that male dominance and female subordination in history, and it's difficult to really talk about history if we're not mindful of lapses like this. Uh, because I mean that's the only way we could progress forward. I would want to say that. And so she says, I want to examine the critical social theory of Habermas as elaborated in the theory of communicative action and related recent writings. I intend to read this work from the standpoint of several specific questions. In what propositions and in what respects does Habermas's critical theory clarify and or mystify the basis of male dominance and female subordination in modern societies? In what propositions in what proportions and in what respects does it challenge and or replicate prevalent ideological rationalizations of such dominance and subordination? To what extent does it or can it be made to serve the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the contemporary women's movement? In short, with respect to gender, what is critical and what is not in Habermas's social theory? So with that, we're able to see how this essay is structured and what are her underlying motives of engaging Habermas's social theory. Okay, so perhaps I could stop there for the introduction, and maybe we could have some discussions, or if we would want to proceed to the first part. I would appreciate if some of you have your videos on. Yes po, Doc. Doctor.
Good evening, Anton. Good evening to everyone.
Doc.
Nadidinig mo ba ako?
Apo.
Magbukas ang computer ko kaya cellphone to ang ginagamit ko. Ayaw kong papasukin sa laptop eh. Anyway, so dito pa lang tayo sa first part, ano?
Apo, sa introduction. Nasa introduction.
Dito sa introductory part, I would even say na kahit dito sa initial paragraph na to, you can already para bang sense not just the structure of the article as you said ago. Hindi lang yung structure kundi pati yung overall sentiment ni Nancy Fraser. Dahil what I read from here, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The first 10 lines. Doon pa lang sa first 10 lines na yon ng opening paragraph, you can already have a sense, like I said, of the sentiments of Nancy Fraser against Habermas. And apparently, itong sentiment na to parang really establishes yung contrary position of Fraser against Habermas. It's as if Fraser in this introductory part is saying that not only is Habermas' critical theory not Marxist enough, she's also saying that it is not political enough. Babasahin ko lang itong part na to na para sa akin interesting dito sa introductory part na to yung what is so appealing about this definition is its straightforward political character. He's referring to Marx. No?
Mm-hmm.
It makes no claim to any special epistemological status, but rather supposes that with respect to justification, there is no philosophically interesting difference between a critical theory of society and a critical one. That part, I think, is referring to Habermas. Kasi Habermas is really doon sa book niya on communicative rationality and transformation of the public sphere. He's coming from a very Kantian position. At yun yung sinasabi ni Fraser dito na a critical theory that founds itself on epistemology ay parang does not really offer a fine distinction between an uncritical critical theory and a truly critical theory. And just to drive home her point, sinabi niya rito na a critical social theory frames its research program and its conceptual framework with an eye to the aims and activities of those oppositional social movements. And that's what Fraser did the entire article. Para bang later on, paragraph after paragraph, she would disclose the things that Habermas didn't pay attention to or the elements that Habermas overlooked. At kung titingnan mo, parang ang dami. Parang walang sinabing tama si Habermas. So, this article or this fragment of a book basically is bad news for Habermas lovers. Especially kayo, Anton. Kasi kinukuha niyo si Habermas ngayon. So, nakakatuwa dahil this is coming from someone who seems to talagang understand and knows Habermas that much. Yun lang, Anton.
Thank you po. Doc Pao po also raised his hand.
Hello, good evening. Am I audible?
Yes po, Doc. Good evening po.
All right. Thank you, Anton, for reading bits of the introduction of the piece that we are tackling today. I agree with most of Doc Jovi's comments. No? However, I'd also like to go back to the first line of the essay, where Fraser borrows the definition of Marx of what is critical theory. Well, of course, Marx did not refer to this as critical theory. Basically, if I may interpret this passage from Marx, it's more of a description of what philosophy is all about. The imperative of philosophy, which is the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. This is a very, I think, I agree with Fraser. It's a very concise and I think precise description of what philosophy ought to do. And of course, critical theory is an alternative name for that kind of philosophy that clarifies the struggles and wishes of the age. But the phrase itself, to my mind, is very Kantian. Because if you again go back to the preface of the Critique of Pure Reason, that's precisely what Kant wants to do. Yes, it is coming from a more or less epistemological standpoint, but Kant in the critique of pure reason, wants to, in a way, go through a self-clarification of reason. My interpretation of the critique of pure reason, which I mentioned this to Brother Romy before, and I don't know if he he probably disagrees with me. But I interpret the critique of pure reason as Kant's, and I think Kant did not really intend it to be so. But at the end, I think the critique provides us with a revelation that human reason is utterly limited. So that critique. So remember, Kant begins the critique of pure reason by saying that he wants to prove that metaphysics is a science, or at least he wants to find out whether metaphysics is a science. As you read the critique of pure reason, it is as if that original question dissipates. Because at the end of the critique, the very question whether metaphysics is a science is in a way inadvertently abandoned, because what is revealed is precisely the limitations of human reason. So in a way, the critique of pure reason is a self-clarification of the limitations of human reason. In that sense, this line from Marx, this description of critical theory from Marx as a self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age, in a way, has, at least to me, a Kantian undertone. But of course, Kant is not an epistemologist in the sense that Kant was an epistemologist. And this first paragraph of Fraser's essay is I like it. It's an apt description of what critical theory is. And I think, and another thing that I want to mention, I think one of the reasons, or maybe the main reason why, in this particular essay, he is attacking attacking Habermas. I think because when she was writing this essay, Habermas was the figure of the Frankfurt School, the main figure of the Frankfurt School. He was the superstar of the Frankfurt School at the time, and so most of the commentaries on Frankfurt School critical theory were either addressed, were of course addressed to the works of Habermas, but at the same time, and of course, as they address Habermas, they either agree or disagree. But what I like at the same time with Fraser's essay, this particular essay in particular, not really like, but what I notice rather is that on the one hand, he's very critical of Habermas, but on the other hand, she also gives Habermas enough credence, because as a matter of fact, Habermas provides some sort of a starting point, for the possibility of, Habermas precisely exposes that performatively, in his work. He performs in his work the lack of gender, I don't know, for lack of a better term, gender sensitivity. So basically, in a way, Fraser is doing something similar to Irigaray, for example, criticizing male epistemology. So in this sense, Habermas's work is an example of a profoundly male-oriented philosophy. At least we understand that, at least via Fraser. As to whether Habermas intended it to be so, or whether he was aware of it, I think in a way Fraser mentions that too. That's precisely one of the characteristics of male, this kind of male-dominated epistemology or philosophy. It's just that it is not aware that it is male-dominated or male-dominant. Um, and so yeah, I agree that when a Habermas fanatic reads this, uh, um, that fanatic will be disturbed, no? But Fraser is just one among the many, really, that criticizes Habermas this way. There are many authors out there. If you read, for example, the book of the title of the work is Critique and Disclosure. What's that name again? Yung best friend ko si Compridis, right? If you read his work, that the whole book is a critique of Habermas. What he does there in that book uh, is parang Habermas is already in the ground, no, in the floor, and he keeps on kicking Habermas. That's how I would describe it. So walang kawala is Habermas in a way. But at the same time, I think Habermas is important. It's important. Habermas is an important figure that I think in a way Habermas helped phrase her arguments. Uh, okay, yun lang muna. I talk too much, pero yun lang muna. And then I have many more comments, pero let's give the others their chance. Thank
Thank you
you.
po, Doc. Yeah, I think I mean just to bring both what you said po, I mean Doc Pao and Doc Jove together. I think uh, the lack of I mean if we're just gonna put if I'm just gonna put it this way, the lack of critique in Habermas's critical theory, or the lack of the critical impulse is yeah, mindful of that male bias. I mean, in Habermas's work, but I mean that lack of. I think that's what Doc Jovi wanted to point out earlier, that that inability to reflect on society's problems. I mean, if for example what Habermas is doing, and if we call that critical theory, that's why we call it the linguistic turn to critical theory. But if that would be the face of critical theory, let's say today, uh, would it respond really to the needs of society, or is philosophy self-conscious of itself? I think I mean, sige, Doc, what yung I was gonna say something, I just forgot.
Hello, Anton, are you still there?
Yes, you raise your hand.
Because I think we're losing your audio.
Hello, could you hear me now?
Or anyway, sige, Anton, you just continue and then kasi napindot ko lang yung raise hand.
Okay. Uh, and so I think that's that lack of critique in
think we lost Anton.
Ayun. Hello, sorry. Bigla pong nawala yung internet namin. Anyway, so I think that's the lack of critique in Habermas's work. I mean, it fails to be mindful really of the problems of the time, and more so. I mean, he of all people should be mindful of gender discourse. I would say. Perhaps that's the failure nga of that bias he presumes already. Na well, it's just language. At the end of the day, it's just language. It's communicative action. So he would classify it into different domains and stuff. Yes, po, Doc.
Yeah. As to whether Habermas is not, I mean, the critical theory of Habermas is not critical enough. It depends really on who's, I think it depends on who's reading him. Because we could basically level the same argument against or criticism against many philosophers, Heidegger. Uh, I mean, even I mean, even Levinas or recur because they did not address the issue of gender specifically, no, or the issue of gender or related issues to gender equality are not uh, clearly addressed, or they don't parang uh, they don't emerge clearly in their writings. And so as if they are not concerned about these issues. I think, like I said earlier, parang what happened is Fraser called out Habermas precisely because Habermas was the greatest figure of the Frankfurt School uh, several decades ago, and there's also kind of in a way internal politics. I don't know if that's the best description, pero there's always this as I describe in several of my essays also, that there's within the critical theory tradition, there's always this uh, kind of battlefield for theoretical leverages, no? So it happened, for example, between uh, Adorno or Keimer on the one hand, and then Habermas, right? Also happened between Habermas and Honneth. And so the same thing is happening here. It's kind of the discourse itself is a battlefield of theoretical leverages. So what's happening is Fraser is um, also putting forward an argument that in a way parang she's fighting that battle of theoretical leverage. Uh, and so what, in as much as Habermas was the figurehead of critical theory or Frankfurt School critical theory during the time when Fraser wrote this, uh, parang in other words, all the how should I say it, flaws, if you want, no, or yung mga pagkukulang. Kasi in a way, one could even say that Habermas, of course, presented his brand of critical theory. Depends on who's reading his work. Uh, One would either construe that brand of critical theory as less critical. It depends on in the case of Fraser, for her it's less critical because because Habermas did not uh, address a specific issue that for Fraser is um, the most important contemporary issue, and it so happens that that important philosophical issue for Fraser has something to do with uh, you know uh, uh, gender asymmetry or things that are related to uh, issues on gender. In other words, going back to that definition of critical theory, I think what Fraser is saying is that there should be a specificity to to the kind of critique that a critical theory in a particular moment in history should be exposing. I don't know if that makes sense. So in this particular point in history, for Fraser, this is the most important, no, the most pressing issue. Parang ganon ang nangyayari, which Habermas did not address. So it would appear that Habermas's critical theory is not critical enough because it does not address this specific pressing issue at this juncture in history. Um, sige, yun muna.
Actually, I think that's why Fraser raises this critique of Habermas. It's because if you would just simply posit the ability, for example, to communicate as I wouldn't say an antidote, but a response to crisis, wouldn't you in the process assume a certain lack of any leverage of one party? Uh, and I think yes. I mean, you're very right to point out that it's Fraser is the one who brings gender into perspective. However, that criticism of Habermas is also shared by other thinkers, right? I mean, between man and woman, but also like that binary opposition and other um, I'm not really sure which is the correct word, gender or sexuality. And then also amongst, well, what Habermas is doing is to posit that amongst social classes. But even if we would look, for example, the global north and the global south, I mean, is it is it even theoretically possible? Uh, I'm not really sure. However, maybe it would be better if we could, because the first part would at least give some flesh to what we're saying now. Um, who is for the first part? Because I sent an email earlier. Um, okay, Micah and Justin. Are they here? Micah and Justin? Okay. Would someone want to highlight some things on the first part of the essay? Maybe
I think it's interesting to talk about the two spheres that Fraser identified in the work of Habermas. I mean, the two spheres that Habermas identifies
yeah.
in
Okay.
his
So,
work, that Fraser uh, criticizes, the two spheres in detail.
okay. Maybe we begin with well, just the first one here, the distinction between symbolic reproduction and material reproduction. Well, the distinction between these two reproduction is in the first instance a functional one. It distinguishes two different functions that must be fulfilled more or less successfully if a society is to survive. At the same time, however, the distinction is used by Habermas to classify actual social practices and activities. These are distinguished according to which one of the two functions they are held to serve exclusively or primarily. Thus, according to Habermas, in capitalist societies, the activities and practices that make up the sphere of paid work count as material reproduction activities, since, in his view, they are social labor and serve the function of material reproduction. On the other hand, the child rearing activities and practices that in our society are performed without pay by women in the domestic sphere, let us call them women's unpaid child rearing work, count as symbolic reproduction activities, since in Habermas's view, they serve socialization and the function of the symbolic reproduction. If I'm not mistaken, the symbolic, I mean, he talks about how well he analyzes the world. Like, we could put it that way. So there is that there is the material reproduction and also the symbolic reproduction. So in terms of material reproduction, and this he I mean she talks about his work more later on. We're talking about the actual movement of society. That's why she includes here paid labor, whereas in symbolic reproduction we have unpaid labor. And what she points out, what is quite well, more of quite quite something worth noting, just to use what she said, something worth noting is that child rearing, childbearing, maturation of children is part of that symbolic reproduction. Uh, Although later she points out that, well, if it's not for this, we won't have any of any of these spheres. And so that's one thing that Nancy Fraser really points out here at the beginning, how that role of the woman is relegated, well, at least in Habermas's theory, indirectly, the role of the woman is relegated to the domestic sphere. That role is placed or is just presumed to be part of like a minor role in society. Um, Let me just read through this next paragraph. It is worth noting, I think, that Habermas's distinction between symbolic and material reproduction is susceptible to two different interpretations. The first of these takes the two functions as two objectively distinct natural kinds, to which both the actual social practices and the actual organizations of activities in any given society may correspond more or less faithfully. Thus, child rearing practices would in themselves be symbolic reproduction practices, whereas the practices that produce food and objects would in themselves be material reproduction practices. And modern capitalist social organization, unlike, say, that of archaic societies, would be a faithful mirror of the distinction between the two natural kinds, since it separates these practices institutionally. Uh, this makes me think. So, and perhaps we would want to discuss this besides others. What Habermas does is to write a certain history of society, and maybe some of us don't yet know he has upcoming works concerning the history of philosophy. He talks about them from the vantage of both religion and reason. But I think that is one of the shortcomings, as what Nancy Fraser would want to point out, that if we're trying to write about these narratives, uh, uh, people who are already oppressed in society become more oppressed by simply sidelining them. So, and she points out here, at least in the beginning, that that activity of child rearing, although it may seem a very trivial role, it may seem a very domestic role, it has a central role, in fact, if we talk about major narratives of society. So, again, as what I mentioned earlier, later she says, well, if it's not for this activity that a mother does, we wouldn't have even the capitalist sphere to operate in. We wouldn't have any form of material reproduction. Yeah, so maybe I could stop there. Yes po, Doc. Doc.
Yeah, of course, we'd love to hear the comments of the other participants. No, but I think just to respond to what Anton read, I think there are two things that are happening. Of course, first is Fraser. Uh, I think Fraser. The first thing that I noticed is that Fraser is criticizing Habermas, not because of the two spheres, but because it seems like for her, the way Habermas presents the two spheres in the theory of communicative action is that it is as if these spheres are mutually exclusive,
Mm.
right? They're mutually exclusive, as if the sphere of labor uh, is exclusive from the sphere of culture, for lack of a better term, right? Um, what what Fraser is trying to do, or trying to say rather, is that these spheres are not exactly mutually exclusive. And so she even says that the distinction between public and private is also questionable because there's so much public in the private and private in the public. In other words, later on she will talk about the two spheres as having basically the same problems and issues, and that there's all in as much as there is oppression in the labor the sphere of labor, right? There's also oppression in the sphere of the family, no, in the private sphere. Um, it's just that, and this is, I think, the second level to the criticism. It's just that for the way Habermas presents the spheres as if the private or the symbolic sphere is not only mutually exclusive but insulated from the troubles of the public sphere. She tries to show that she tries to show that, as a matter of fact, there is no uh, there is no protection from the public. No? Uh, in other words, the boundary, the distinction is blurred. No, uh, between the public and the private. Um, Sige, yung iba, baka yung iba gusto magsalita, nahihiya lang.
If someone po would want to add to the discussion, please feel free. Okay, just raise your hand or ano. You could chat you could type your comments, but of course we'd prefer you to speak. Yeah. Maybe just to continue. I mean, I just want to sige po, Doc Chavia. Thank you.
Ano siguro yung for those who also wish to update not just the position of Habermas but also the position of Fraser. Kasi parang dun sa symbolic sphere, di ba, Habermas is describing yung child rearing as an example of an unpaid work, di ba? And itong si Fraser, she seems to agree with that description, although she's criticizing the kind of distinction or polarity that Habermas is proposing. Sabi ko kanina na yung position of Fraser may be updated siguro from the point of view of a third world country like the Philippines, kasi hindi lang from the point of view of a third world country like the Philippines, but from the point of view of those countries who or which have been importing Filipino labor to do precisely yung work of child rearing. I have in mind right now yung mga ine-export natin na caregivers, babysitters, domestic help, na nagpo-provide ng child rearing. In other words, at one point of the essay, sabi ni Fraser, sana ma-consider ni Habermas yung bang overlapping of these spheres. And that overlapping is likewise encroaching not just the spheres but the very functions that women are performing. At doon sa trabaho ng mga caregivers natin o mga domestic help natin o mga babysitters natin, nakikita mo na yung overlap na yun. Na if that is the context, parang we can no longer describe child rearing really as unpaid work. Now, it's another discussion siguro kung itatanong natin kung yung bang ganong klaseng transformation of child rearing ay does it work for the cause of women's labor, or does it really push forward yung cause ng women's identity and the kind of job that they're doing. It's not being addressed by this article, or it's not being addressed by Nancy Fraser herself. Kaya sabi ko, baka this is something that, I don't know, members of the group or other students might want to pick up, no? Kasi yun yung isang bagay na escapes the perspective of Nancy Fraser.
Just to add to that, Jovi, and thank you for
Go ahead,
that.
sir.
Thank you for that comment, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, because it's also something that I wanted to address. In as much as Fraser seems to be criticizing Habermas for the somewhat functional description of the material sphere and the symbolic sphere, as a matter of fact, she also doesn't go beyond that functional description. Specifically because she argues that the symbolic is as much the material. She says that child rearing, for example, is unpaid, and it gives us this impression that she is vying for paid. Child rearing as paid labor, and should be the case. And of course, she's coming from the point of view of a first world nation where child rearing is really relegated to domestic helpers, and there are even agencies, no, and parang meron pang specific child care, I don't know how to call them, pero parang in other words, my problem is that Fraser also have this functionalist description of the symbolic as much as the material, and so at the end, and in a way, I think I agree with you. In the end, she doesn't really address the importance of the symbolic beyond the functional, if that makes sense. And this is the same problem that Honneth has with Fraser. I remember they had a debate on recognition and redistribution, because the argument of Fraser is basically the main problem of society today is redistribution. And meanwhile, Honneth is saying that there's probably something more fundamental than redistribution, something more fundamental than reading all this in economic terms. Pero of course, that's part of the argument of Fraser, that much of the critique of oppression focuses on race, for example, or class, but not so much on gender. But at the same time, there's this other layer, no, that's incorporated in her discussion of gender. She understands this against the backdrop of capitalism, no, against the backdrop of present day capitalism. That's why when you read her critique of Habermas, when she mentions the symbolic and the material, and she says that Habermas distinguishes the two as if they are mutually exclusive, but as a matter of fact, Fraser says they are intertwined in a way. My problem, however, is that that intertwining seems to me read in parang still in a pragmatic functionalist language or discourse. So the question later on is, so how do we solve the problem? Is it in so should we solve the problem by paying, for example, uh, uh, um, care? I mean, child rearers even in the home, parang ganon. No? So I'm not criticizing that view. Maybe that could be a solution. Pero even the essay itself is open-ended. It does not address that specific question. No? At the end, the only thing that we can, you know, get from the from the essay is it's something that is not exactly specific, because on the one hand, she seems to be arguing that. Still arguing for redistribution, right? The redistribution of wealth, the redistribution of money. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, she also seems to be arguing that the ultimate emancipation of women, specifically, is when we destroy the structures. You know? When we basically destroy the distinction between the material and the symbolic. But parang hindi pa clear sa akin if the destruction of the distinction between the symbolic and the material would actually result in something favorable.
I think I mean to add to that, um, the problem also is because of the ambiguity of of when those spheres merge, what you pointed out, Doc. Um, and concerning the child rearing, I don't think that would be a. I mean, it's not just about child rearing to be paid, but I think also, I mean, what is the role of child rearing? I think I would read it that way. It's a question directed to society, like how, or to Habermas, how would we consider child rearing, considering that it has these effects on the one hand, but on the other hand, we still maintain it as a domestic affair. I mean, I think the ambiguity that it causes, I mean, having those two things, uh, I mean, it just causes more problems because ambiguity could not really address issues. I mean, that's why towards the end of the essay, Fraser is a bit critical of the welfare state that Habermas would side for because of the ambiguity that is equated with parang, I mean, in Filipino we say parang nagiging panakikbutas minsan. So there's a problem instead really of addressing it. Let's just do like this. Let's just do like that. I think what Doc Jovi mentioned earlier was, I mean, it made me think about that. Na today, instead of being able to focus sa mga ganitong issues, what happens is like a band-aid solution. Well, let me get someone else to take care of, for example, my children, in the aspects of child rearing. And I think that makes discussions on modernization or enlightenment uh, ambiguous to the extent that, I mean, if we follow Habermas, I mean, how spheres are indeed separated, they become ambiguous all the more as we allow them to merge with one another. Well, because the separation is artificial. But the fact that we allow this artificiality uh, I mean, we get caught up. I mean, kasi I want to use what you, Doc Pao, mentioned, the semantic arbitrariness. We get caught up in that arbitrariness that we cannot even posit a consistent narrative of which belongs to one camp. Kasi we just made up that classification, that division. At the end of the day, we are unable to maintain that division. I think that's the problem, because of the ambiguity that creates.
Yeah, and when you read the essay, it's the same problem,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-mm. Yeah.
It's really a I mean, a set of semantic symbolisms against another set of semantic symbolisms. Or I don't know if we could even put semantic and the word semantic and symbolism together. Uh, but yeah, it's the semantic of Habermas against the semantic of Fraser. It's yung binanggit ko kanina yung theoretical leverages. That's part of the difficulty of reading philosophy, because philosophy in itself is ambiguous. But that's why we have to be extra careful. What is it exactly that Fraser is saying here? Um, uh, what she's saying, I suppose, is when she criticizes Habermas, the distinction between symbolic and material is, sabi ko nga, it is as if for Habermas, the symbolic is insulated from the material sphere. What Habermas, according to Fraser, what Habermas does not emphasize or ignores, rather, Habermas ignores the fact that even within the symbolic, there are instances of oppression. The symbolic represented by the nuclear family, according to her. Within the nuclear family, there are also instances of oppression that a philosopher like Habermas does not emphasize or does not mention. And more specifically, in the middle of that oppression is the woman, the mother, the daughter, uh, and therefore, even within that symbolic realm, the patriarchal, culture is dominant. And what she's saying is, someone like Habermas, the figurehead of the Frankfurt School critical theory, is not able to mention even that. Now, I agree with her with regard to that, but at the end, it's not yet clear uh, what sort of solution she intends to present, or to uh, it is at least what we can gather from her arguments is that there's this dominant structure that is oppressive to women, and the oppression can only stop when we destroy that structure. Uh, but the essay itself does not tell us how to do that. And there is also this, like I said earlier, there's also this uh, there's also this part of the essay that seems to uh, read the symbolic realm like I said, in functionalist terms. So I don't know what kind of solution is it. Is the solution also pragmatic or functionalist, or is it more than that? And yun yung yun naman yung argument or criticism ni Axel Honneth. Maybe there's something more fundamental than um, um, understanding all this in pragmatic terms.
Okay, I think before po I read po Doc Darlene's comment, the one I just said earlier, just to hinge it to the text, it was because of Doc Pao mentioned po kasi how the capitalist system. I mean, we separate the home from society, public from private. That's why I brought the text here. And my response earlier was based. I have another one open. Consider that here. Consider that the conception of modernization as the uncoupling of systems and life world institutions tends to legitimize the modern institutional separation of family and official economy, child rearing, and paid work, which would lead us also, I mean, to what Dr. Arlene chatted in our. I think, let me just read it. I think it would help to remember that Fraser's work is an attempt to extend Marx's critique of capitalism. The problem with the distinction that Habermas made between material labor and social labor is that it reinforces capitalist exploitation of women. Domestic labor, unpaid work is work. How are we supposed to progress in our reflection if we cannot even recognize domestic labor as a kind of work? I think we tend to disregard this major issue. Yeah. Before po I call Doc Jovi, I really agree to that. We tend, especially in Habermas's presentation, as how Doc Pao uh, explained to us also earlier, we tend to, I mean, with that, that's what I mentioned earlier. I mean, that's what I meant with when I said we have that major theory is how Habermas presents it. We tend to just brush things under the rug, and exactly what lies at heart what lies at heart here is how the role of the so-called feminine is not that essential to society, or in material sense. I mean, in material sense, it's not that essential. But Fraser tries to write against this. That separation is arbitrary. That separation is arbitrary, and it is something. It is something very vital. And I think all of us here would agree to that. It is something very vital, really, for society. Uh, and maybe parenthetically, I mean, just to add to this, that's why, I mean, we see the history of, at least in Foucault's work, right, the history of confessions, of admitting. I mean, at the receiving end of punishment, quote unquote punishment, is the woman. We could say that. I would say that more or less it is the woman in history. Okay, Doc Jovi, before we could proceed to the next part, because it is a nice transition to the second part.
No, actually, yun nga sana i-raise ko yung point written by Darlene. And I also wish to react to it sana. And then, sana yung female members of the group can likewise react to what I'm going to say. Kasi yung, just to further highlight what I was trying to say earlier, sabi ko na something that might be endemic to our situation, but it's not addressed by the points being raised by Fraser. For example, no, yung sounds like a movie, pero I know of someone from my own place, doon sa Bulacan, na she'll be leaving this April to work as domestic help sa Hong Kong. Actually, domestic help na ang task niya is to really look after parang 1-year-old or 2-year-old baby na kanyang employer. Ito yung problema no? On one hand, itong taong ito, yung child rearing na yon, she considers that as an employment. So, in a way, parang work talaga yon. Kung magagaling ako doon sinasabi ni Darlene kanina, here we have a situation where child rearing is really acknowledged and perform as work, paid work. Pero sa punto de vista ng employer niya, kaya siya kinuha, kaya nag-import ng isang Filipina caregiver is precisely because sa tingin ng employer niya, that kind of child rearing gets in the way of work in the sense of material production or material sphere ni Habermas. So, kaya kanina, I was trying to say na hindi ko alam kung yung bang ganong klase na here we have a kababayan magtatrabaho siya, engage herself in child rearing as a paid work. Will that advance yung cause ng feminist agenda that Nancy Fraser is espousing? Or even not Nancy Fraser, any women's group or feminist group, for example. Kaya sabi ko kanina, kung aside from Ma'am Darlene, baka there are other female members of the group na who would like to react. Dahil I myself have very limited knowledge of kung ano ng permutations ngayon ng feminist theory. And definitely your perspective on this problem will enrich our own take and engagement of Habermas's text. Kasi parang kung titingnan mo yung classification ni Habermas, yung how these systems work, no? Napaka-rigid ng kanyang mga classification, no? Napaka-rigid ng kanyang mga structure. And in fact, he's being called out by Fraser on doing this, no? Kasi at one point in the essay, sasabihin ni Fraser na may mga functions and there are intersections where these spheres and functions would overlap. At hindi yon nakikita ni Habermas. And like I said, kung titingnan mo through the lens of a very complicated society like the Philippines, ang daming overlapping functions, no? Ang daming overlapping spheres. Okay? Yun lang. Sa tingin ko, coming from what Ma'am Darlene said a while ago, even if we recognize child rearing as work in the sense of material production, it remains a problem when seen in the context of the feminist agenda, using the example I gave a while ago. Doon lang muna. Let's see if the other members of the group would react.
Salamat po, Dok. Would someone want to add to that before we call Jean?
Hello po. Can I say something?
Yes po, Dok.
Yeah. Sir Jovi, just a question po. Parang parang what's your understanding of the feminist agenda so that it's clear to me?
Wala akong specific na sagot dyan, Darlene. I'm just following kung ano man yung sinasabi ni Fraser dito. Actually, sa article na to, I am on the side of Fraser. Nakikita ko yung, like I said, na like she said, si Fraser, yung maraming struggles and form of social movements na hindi na-recognize si Habermas, and I'm glad that Nancy Fraser was able to point them out. So kung Nancy Fraser is parang pushing for hindi lang recognition ng mga babae, kundi recognition, for example, ng struggles and conflicts that women undergo. In the context of this essay, yun yung understanding ko ngayon.
Okay po. Sir, pwede mag-reply? Okay lang po.
Syempre naman. Sige,
Ay,
go
opo,
ahead.
opo. I don't know if I'm qualified to answer for the feminist because I cannot yet identify myself as a feminist since I don't know, parang I lack knowledge of the history, and parang in terms of feminism, I'm a late bloomer. It's just recently that I started to engage or read some of their works. So kasi parang Fraser distinguishes herself from liberal feminism, which is the kind of feminism that we know today, mainstream feminism, wherein it's just about recognizing women. Parang it's an exclusive kind of feminism which is available to those who are capable of climbing up the ladder of recognition. It's just like it's a kind of feminism which argues that, okay, I can be an empowered woman if I'm educated and I can become parang an executive, or I can occupy a position of power if I have if I have the social capital and I have gone through the training, and I can go again and fight against men or male for the same position. If I can like be articulate and speak of what I think, I can be that kind of woman. That's basically mainstream feminism, or let's say liberal feminism. And Fraser is not, she distinguishes herself from this kind of feminism. In fact, she recognizes intersectionality in feminism, and parang in her argument is that the kind of feminism that she is fighting for is a kind of feminism wherein everyone can be part of the struggle. It will not just be exclusive to women who have the social capital to be recognized. In her other works, she said, I don't want to say merely, she said that her work is dedicated to parang being recognized, or starting with the fact that we should recognize that the power of those paid and unpaid work sustains the world. So I think she's coming from recognition is not the perfect word for it, but she's trying to, I think one of her major argument is she's trying to tell us that it's about time that we stop trivializing the work of women. For example, in the domestic field, or parang care responsibilities, child rearing and stuff like that, which hasn't been parang recognized before. It's time that we don't just think of that as something which contributes to the capital, but in fact it's something which sustains the world. So it's a statement which is very parang there's a lot to unpack in that kind of statement. And I'm not sort of like, I haven't read a lot of Fraser. In fact, this is my first Fraser text, although I've already like wanted to read her before, and I think this opportunity because I get the chance to read her work. So I don't have an answer to the question about like what could be the solution that she is offering. I don't think she is offering a kind of solution, but in this specific chapter, she said that her work is to extend, to broaden Habermas's critical theory. So and even Marx, like her whole project is like an extension of Marx, and her way of doing that is by making us aware that for the longest time gender is something that we have been um neglecting, or something that we have been putting on the side. I don't know, but my thoughts are everywhere. I'm sorry.
No, no, it's perfect po. Thank you po, Doc, for that. I'm sorry. This is just something personal. I mean, I want to affirm that. What you said po, Doc, about hindi kasi parang I grew up na, for example, like cooking. I only found out that cooking is a feminine role in school when I entered elementary, because at home, my dad kasi is a chef. My first impression of cooking was that it's something that a man and a woman could do. I did not get the idea that, oh, it's something that like the wife should, not should, but I hope you all get me. Uh, is the one doing it, while men are the ones working outside. I think I mean, just to hinge my reply to that, before po I call Doc Pao. I mean, this is what I'm banking on when when Nancy Fraser says this: the citizen role is in male-dominated classical capitalism is therefore a manifestly masculine role. Uh, we should recognize the role of, I mean, the enormous import that the feminine contributes. I hope you get what I mean. Um, because I mean, we're just part of this system, and by not recognizing that, we further ramify the negative effects, so to speak, of the system. Anyway, but maybe Doc Pao could say it better than me. Doc.
Okay, thank you, Anto. I don't know if I could say anything better than anybody else here. But I think I would like to thank Darlene and Jovi, for that exchange, uh, and specifically on whether there is a solution. Uh, um, well, I think it's not so much a solution that we're looking for. It's my engagement with Fraser is it's not so much on her work on feminism, but her work on redistribution, and specifically her exchange with Honet on the difference between redistribution and um, and recognition. Um, uh, and I agree with I mentioned it earlier. It's hard to disagree with Fraser when you read this essay. It's hard to disagree with her, um, and it's also a revelation. That's why I think everyone should read this, uh, um, and feminists should also read Fraser. Um, I appreciate the distinction that Darlene made between what she referred to as the liberal feminists, uh, and the kind of feminism that Fraser is trying to present in her work. It's not mainstream feminism in the sense that it's coming from um, yes, it's coming from critical theory and specifically from Marx. Um, the interesting thing is, and this is in a way one of the things that was discussed in that book where Fraser and Honneth debated, is that yes, it's important to recognition, um, because the problem in that particular exchange between Honneth and Fraser is that for um, Honneth reads Fraser's idea of recognition, of redistribution, as the only means or the only form of recognition. Honneth is arguing that no, it's just redistribution, that the redistribution of wealth is just one of the many forms of recognition. So, and Honneth thinks that Fraser has this tendency of reducing the idea of recognition to redistribution. But that's the exchange between Honneth and um, and Fraser. Um, the idea of recognition is actually very broad, very complex. That's why the question later on is yes, we recognize because this is precisely what uh, Fraser wants to do in the essay, in this specific essay. She wants us to recognize that not only because of Habermas, but Habermas is just a representative of this long history uh, of of uh, male dominance in philosophy. This specific, this dominant epistemology, male oriented epistemology, um, that that ignores specific nuances, and the nuance that Fraser wants us to understand is that even if we have the distinction between the material and the symbolic, we cannot make a strict distinction because, like I said, and I'm just reading Fraser, within the symbolic itself is not insulated from the troubles of the material. Within the symbolic, maybe it's even within the symbolic that the troubles, or let's say the oppression begins. Uh, Maybe it's even within the symbolic that it begins. Um, and uh, and so what she's trying to do is she's criticizing Habermas because of the rigid distinction, and she's saying that now the symbolic, if you look at the symbolic, it's a microcosm of the material, and the same oppression exists within the symbolic, even more visceral, even more palpable. But even worse because of the misrecognition of, yes, I agree, the work of people, of specifically women within the symbolic. No, the symbolic. In other words, the symbolic is important because without the symbolic, we cannot sustain the material, and that's also and vice versa as well. Uh, Going beyond, of course, the experience of women, we can also understand this when we look at the experience, or we try to look at the experience of, let's say, the academic, right? Because most of us here are academics. I mean, we have a peculiar position in society because, on the one hand, we are paid, so we participate in that materials. We participate in the material sphere, but at the same time, our work is not simply material. It's also symbolic because what we're doing is um, we're trying to basically uh, expand the whole, expand the symbolic realm. Basically, we are trying to cultivate culture and so on. But I think I understand, and we should appreciate Fraser for pointing out that. Yeah, but the difference between the academic, now this is my uh, I'm pointing I'm pointing this out now, but in a way I'm inspired by what Fraser points out in the essay. Now the difference between the academic and the child, or sorry, the mother, for example, is that, of course, the academic is paid while the mother is not. And so that kind of recognition, we are talking about the recognition of the academic and the mother. Uh, then we understand that um, if we're talking about degrees of recognition, then uh, we understand that there's there's some level of misrecognition at the you know um, misrecognition in the realm of the family, the symbolic. But at the same time, I agree with Fraser, but while we agree with Fraser and we understand what she's trying to say, I think dito pumapasok yung question ni Jovi earlier. But then this opens up another can of worms, right? Because it's not, because in the real world it's not as simple as that. Um, uh, Maybe we can, uh, in as much as Fraser is extending the work of Habermas and Marx, we can actually extend the work of Fraser by putting more call this context into the kind of critical theory she's trying to develop. You know? uh, how can we understand then the plight of women in a third world country like the Philippines? Because hindi lang yun yung there's also maybe another aspect of it, no? Yes, women leave the country for paid work, and they go to work in other countries as child rearers, but at the same time they leave their own families. They also leave their children, and the same, and that has an effect whether we admit it or not. That has an effect. The presence of the parent, you know, whether, and it's not even the issue of whether the parent is, you know, whether the family is this traditional nuclear family with a mother and a father and the children. No? It doesn't have to be like that. But just simply the presence of the parent or the parents, in rearing the family, in nurturing the family. But so it's an issue of I don't know how to phrase it, but it's also an issue of absence and presence. Um, Kasi it's not even. I think it goes beyond the feminist discourse as well. What happens to the domain here at home? No, the symbolic domain here at home. If we keep on sending our child rearers and child rearer in whether male or female to other countries. Basically, that feeds. I think what Jovi is trying to point out, isn't it, that also feeds the same capitalistic system. You know, it becomes, how do I put this? It feeds the same capitalistic system that we're trying to overcome. So in other words, those are the questions that this essay opens up.
Thank you po for that, Doc Au. Before po I would call Doc Jovi, maybe I should call first Jim. Maybe Jim would want to point something out from this section to further enhance the discussion.
Good evening.
Ano bro, kamusta? Anong
Okay, so I will continue the second part of the essay. Number two, public and private in classical capitalism, thematizing the gender subtext. We have a flow in the discussion, um, considering the ambiguity a while ago of the spheres of Habermas's theory. In this section, Nancy Fraser made a clarification in these spheres against the backdrop of gender roles. Kaya we'll begin to read in the fourth paragraph in page 124. Habermas provides an extremely sophisticated account on the relations between public and private institutions in classical capitalist societies. At the same time, however, his account evinces some weaknesses. Many of these stem from his failure to thematize the gender subtext of the relations and arrangements he describes. Consider, first, the relations between official private economy and private family as mediated by the roles of worker and consumer. These roles, I submit, are gendered roles, and the links they forge between family and official economy are affected as much in the medium of gender identity as in the medium of money. So I think Fraser wanted to point out the omission on the part of Habermas to take into account gender in his theory, because the private and public schemata of the system and life work, as he pointed out in this section, has gender subtext. For example, the relations between private economy and private family are mediated by the roles of worker and consumer. And this role of a worker, which is associated with males, and consumer associated with female, are gendered roles. And as we continue in reading the next paragraphs, we can see that Nancy Fraser, according to her, the feminine role as a consumer is the least recognized social labor in classical capitalism. And because of this, Fraser is cognizant to the fact that classical capitalism is male-dominated. In this case, women's subordination is obviously found in the workplace or in the private economy. And as we continue further in the paragraphs, we will see the connection of the private sphere and the public sphere, where Fraser also pointed out that the male dominance and the female subordination in the private sphere has a consequence in the public sphere, particularly in the state administration and political decision.
Salamat, Jim. I would want to link that sa question ni Doc Jovi earlier. I think what Nancy Fraser is doing here. I mean, the question of Doc Jovi po earlier was yung would the exportation of labor of precisely child rearing labor enhance that feminist role? Is that could that be a response to Fraser's role? I think that's the question, if we could put it forward. I think what she's doing is to parang to untangle Habermas's presentation of society and the role of communicative action and its emancipatory potential. Because again, I mean, to work on what we've been discussing this evening, Habermas is following that, especially the fact since Habermas positions him in the left, he himself in the left. So Habermas is trying to advance Marxist views in society, and his response to that is by putting forward communicative action. And so Fraser is trying to, well, how I read it, as what Jim pointed out, can the feminine or can the woman be able to, or is recognized in this system in communicative action? Because especially this last point, of Jim for us. The citizen is centrally a participant in political debate and public opinion formation. So the movement from private to public spheres. This means that citizenship, in Habermas's view, depends crucially on the capacities for consent and speech, the ability to participate on a par with others in dialogue. And again, to add a rejoinder to today's time, I mean, all the more in a third world country, for example, is this a questionable thing for us? Because even we know amongst academicians or amongst learned individuals, dialogue is not really something that is viable. I mean, we follow a democratic order, and yet dialogue or discourse is something that is not that evident. Again, so what Fraser is trying to do is to really show how, on the one hand, women labor is already not considered like vital in the sense of material production, while on the other, if we would go further into communicative action, which is Habermas's recourse to that bifurcation, all the more the role of the woman is marginalized, if not completely ignored. I think I would want to comment on that part. Would someone want to add to that, or can we proceed to the rest of the second?
Nagkasa ko na kami yan. Parang.
Sorry po, Doc. Sige po. Sorry, hindi nakabukas yung member. Sige po.
Salamat sa pag-exclude mo sa akin. Nabasa Habermas sa student ka. Anyway, I'd like to begin by affirming yung points raised by Darlene a while ago. Yung tanong niya na how exactly or what exactly is my understanding of feminism. Nakakayaman, pero the only thing that I know about feminism marami. Kumbaga, that's the only thing that kumbaga I can honestly say yung most of the things that I know about feminism are the things that I do not know. In fact, a lot of times I hesitate and I restrain myself from using that word feminist or feminism. Kasi I have this feeling na baka pag ginamit ko yun, I contribute to the fetishization of that term or fetishization of the agenda or ethical or justice agenda of women. Pero basically, I agree with what Darlene mentioned a while ago, yung importansya ng meaning-making na usually women are engaged in. At yung point ko nga has been highlighted by both Doc Pao and Anton and Darlene herself. Pero gusto ko lang i-share yung kanina nung nagsasalita si Darlene, parang 4 o 5 pelikula yata yung pumasok sa isip ko. Yung images sa popular culture ng mga babaeng OFW. At yung mga blockbusters, come to think of it, naggaling sa Pilipinas na pelikula, all of them featured women. I'm thinking of Caregiver ni Sharon Cuneta. I'm thinking of Milan, although stars si Piolo Pascual, pero the whole story revolves around the character of Isa Calzado. Yung pinaka-recent, yung Hello, I Love You, Goodbye. tsaka yung nanalo na yung caregiver din sa Singapore. It's a Singaporean film. Iloilo yata yung title. Sabi ko, come to think of it, yung mga blockbuster na pelikula na ito, dramatizing the plight of female OFWs. On one hand, like I said, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina yung tricky part of the problem. Yung on one hand, it highlights the heroism of women. And at the same time, it highlights the fact that the problem remains unsolved. And like I said, hindi ko alam a while ago, hindi ko alam kung yung ganong treatment, yung ganong perspective about the plight of women and the kind of the roles that hindi na nga the society gives to them or assigns to them. This has now become a role that they themselves para bang assign to themselves. No? Kasi mukhang no one else will do it. Kaya sabi ko kanina yung and when I asked that question, I'm coming from the position na talagang ignorante ako. Yung bang sabi ko kanina, will that advance really yung cause of campaigning or clamoring for better understanding of women's issues or better appreciation of women's role in the society? When I asked that question, I'm really at a loss for any constructive thing to say. It's not even an academic question. It's a question that I also ask myself. Dahil I look at it as an ethical question, as a question of justice. I don't think na inuusap lang natin yung mga tanong na yun for the sake of discussing them. Dahil kung hindi man marami tayong kamag-anak, marami tayong kaibigan who find themselves in the same situation. Sa isang banda, like I said, nakakatuwa dahil si Nancy Fraser are already sharing with us yung mga vital starting points. No? Kanina nabanggit ko yung position niya na why can't Habermas recognize or acknowledge that there is such a thing as a duality of work na sa akin is a bit aggressive at saka highly advanced quote-unquote feminist position. Kasi dito hindi lang siya specifically, and this is something that Darlene already pointed out a while ago, hindi lang niya sinasabing sige, let's focus on this or let's deal with this problem kasi this is a patently feminine problem. Sinasabi ni Nancy Fraser na page 116 yata yun. Yung duality of roles, duality of functions. And I said a while ago na malaki mako-contribute ng mga scholars galing sa Pilipinas in exploring this dahil very unique yung ating bansa na on one hand, napakaraming pathologies that create para bang unjust situations or unethical situations Like for example, bakit nga doon sa mga pelikulang nabanggit ko, Caregiver, Mulan, yung Hello, I Love You, Goodbye, tsaka yung Iloilo, bakit puro babae ang nag-a-abroad? Nasaan ang mga lalaki, asawa nito? So, on one hand, meron ganun. Ano? Pero kung titingnan mo rin, bibihira pa yata yung pelikulang dinibot tungkol sa lalaking naiwan na siya ang naging magulang at napalaki niya ng maayos yung mga anak niya. Iyon yung sinasabi kong example siguro ng yung duality of roles na sinasabi ni Fraser. And doon sa binasa ni Jim kanina, 124 onwards, binalikan uli yun ni binalikan uli yun ni Fraser, yung duality of roles. And then, I think she mentioned something like na, teka lang ha, titanapin ko yung specific text. Ayun, yung page 128 rather, towards the last part ng page 128. Yung sinasabi niya rito yung reconstruction of the gender subtext. Again, reading this from a Filipino perspective, mayaman tayo dito. Nabanggit na ni Antonio, dati iniisip niya na walang gender assignment yung pagluluto. Nung dumating siya sa school, meron pala. Sa probinsya, ganun eh. Yung walang problema kung lalaki naglalaba, walang problema kung lalaki namamalengke. Yung switching of roles have become a part of at least yung non-urbanized setting. At kahit na mga sa mga urbanized setting, may mga pagbabago na nangyayaring gano'n. So, like I said, here and there, makakakita ka ng yung bang parang, how do you call it, pitik ni Nancy Fraser towards that direction. And yun nga, hindi siya fully developed in a sense na at least in this essay, she's only trying to engage Habermas. And the challenge that I've been putting forward since a while ago, yung nga, how I wish that we would see scholars and students from the group or from the department or na explore pa tong sinasabi ni ni Nancy Fraser, not just to give us a better understanding of the inputs of Fraser seen from our context, but also a better understanding of a feminist theory that Nancy Fraser is propounding, which sabi nga ni Darlene kanina, yung she's presenting something new. At least new para sa katulad ko na is not really well versed in feminist theory. Yun muna po, stop there.
Thank you po, Doc, for that. Actually, just the page before it is what it's found in the page before it, what I've been talking about since earlier. Here, the feminine child rearer role links all four institutions to one another by overseeing by overseeing the construction of the masculine and feminine gendered subjects needed to fill every role in classical capitalism. So the centrality of that. Maybe to add more, I mean, with what Doc Jovi gave us, I mean, working on all of our inputs this evening, what Doc Jovi pointed out to us, like the practicality of I mean, well, we could read it that way also. The practical side also to Fraser's position, at least in this essay. Um, maybe we can call um Claire. Is that how you pronounce her name? Claire.
Yes po. Good
Okay,
evening.
Claire.
Okay, so, on the third part, I would like to go dun sa sixth thesis ni Habermas. I think that's more informative in a sense dun sa argument ni Fraser. So first, with regards to the emancipatory potential of new social movements, including feminist movement, according to Habermas, that there's a colonization trait on new social movements, including feminism, and it has this emancipatory resolution. It's on page 131. And first, the removal of system integration mechanisms from symbolic reproduction spheres. Second, the replacement of some normatively secured contexts by communicatively achieved ones. And third, the development of new democratic institutions capable of asserting life world control over state and official economic systems. Habermas claimed that it's not genuinely emancipatory in a sense that these are ambiguous in as much as they tend to retreat into alternative communities and particularistic identities. And Fraser responded to this on page 135 that it has been an experience of conflict and contradiction as women try to do the impossible, namely to juggle simultaneously the existing roles of child rearer and worker, client, and citizen. So on page 135, Fraser provided an explanation or an a, re- a revision, sorry, on what Habermas said on the sixth thesis. And here on page 135 also, on the last part, that the struggles with one another or with state and corporate institutions over the social meaning of woman and man, femininity and masculinity, over the interpretation of women's needs, over the interpretation on social construction of women's bodies, and over the gender norms that shape the major institution mediating social roles. So Fraser is trying to say that these social movements is not intentionally not I mean not it's not intentional that they result to particularistic or that they don't achieve the third part, that is to develop new democratic institution capable of asserting life world control. But Fraser is trying to say that it's a struggle and it's hard for women because first, the design for the public and the private is for masculine and for men. So it's not enough that women are allowed to have paying jobs. But if the design is still a patriarchal one, women will still struggle, and it's hard for women to achieve the third criteria of Habermas because feminist women are struggling in effect to redistribute and democratize access to and control over discursive resources. And women struggles with autonomy in the following special sense, that the measure and the collective property of both private and public is still designed for men. And just like what mentioned by Doc Jovi, no, that the jobs, even if it's paying jobs, it's often still under the gendered roles of women. For example, as a domestic helper. And on the previous chapter also mentioned yung, for example, the caregivers like nurse or the basically what they attribute as the feminine characteristic for women. And then towards the end of the chapter, I mean the part on page 137, Fraser posed a question: should the roles of worker and child rearer, citizens and client be fully degendered? This is a response dun sa how Habermas failed to mention gender, or how gender plays role on the issues and problems that he presents here between the private and public sphere. Because can we really say that it's not gendered, or do we rather require arrangement that permit women to be workers and citizens as women, just as men always been workers and citizens as men? Enough. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Claire. Uh, yeah, actually, that's why I mean, from this long part, this really struck me the most. So we have, from a feminist perspective, there is a more basic battle line between the forms of male dominance linking system to life world and us. Um, I think well, I mean, maybe just part of the conclusion also. We would, I mean, what we get from Fraser's perspective is a more critical position of something already critical in itself, not discrediting, the enormous contributions that Habermas adds to critical theory. But of course, I mean, philosophy stops being philosophy if it fails to, as what Fraser points out in the beginning, to reorient its social embeddedness, and on the second hand, to be critical of itself, right? uh that's why, I mean, let me just read this. Yeah, okay, ask po, Doc Pao.
Go ahead, Anton. Pero baka mawala yung train of thought mo.
Okay. That's why, I mean, injunction to that, I mean, I'll just read this highlighted thing. So one crucial requirement is that this framework not be such as to put the male-headed nuclear family and the state-regulated official economy on two opposite sides of the major categorical divide. We require rather a framework sensitive to the similarities between them, and so on. A framework that allows a more inclusive approach, I think. That's why when when I mean, in the previous chapter, in the previous part, outlined to us by Claire, when Fraser critiques Habermas's idea of a liberal, sorry, of a welfare state. I mean, she tries to show how ambiguity still thrives within that. And I think, from our position today, we must be critical of such ambiguities that mask problems. I mean, instead of what I said earlier, like naging panakibutas, it becomes a stopgap. Uh, just that makes us ignore even bigger problems. So I just called Doc Paupo first, and then after Doc Bernie.
Yeah, just very quickly, because you mentioned mentioned the first line again. So I'd like to go back to the idea of critical theory, and why I think what Fraser is offering here is a kind of feminist critical theory. And why is it critical theory? But basically, going back to that phrase from Karl Marx, no, it's a kind of self-understanding. But what I have here is the New German Critic version. It's on page 110. I don't know, kasi you have the chapter version. But I'll just read the part here. Where, well, here Fraser's challenging the premises of Habermas, of course, no? Specifically the strict demarcation, no, between the two spheres that we've been talking about. But here she writes, child rearing is a dual aspect activity, and since it is not categorically different in this respect from other work, there is no warrant for the claim of an asymmetry vis-a-vis a system integration. That is, there is no warrant for assuming that the system integrated organization of child rearing would be any more or less pathological than that of other work. So there are two levels there. The first level is that, again, she's saying that the strict distinction or absolute distinction that Habermas Habermas points out, uh, is problematic. Of course, that's the first level, and she has been repeating that all throughout the essay. But the second part of what I read, I think this is why what she's doing is critical theory, because basically, um, what she's trying to do is to expose uh, what is pathological within spheres that we don't usually oh, sorry she's trying to expose what is pathological within spheres that we usually take for granted or ignore. And specifically here, she's talking about what we ignore within the sphere of the symbolic, right? And so what she's doing there is a kind of critical theory, because it's more it's a self clarification of pathological instances within a specific sphere. And I think that's what she means when she borrows that idea of critical theory from Karl Marx, the self clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. So, more specifically, when she criticizes the distinction that the distinction of Habermas, she does this by pointing out that what Habermas ignores, and in that sense, then Habermas is less a critical theorist than we are led to believe, because he ignores something. Um, he ignores pathologies within that specific sphere that he insulates from the other sphere. So yeah, it just occurred to me when you mentioned again that description from Marx.
Thank you po, Doc. Yeah. Doc Darlene po.
Hello, thank you. This is parang I would be like relating a personal story. Just to concretize what I think is Fraser's point. I think in this last part towards the conclusion, she's trying to tell us that gender neutral is also problematic. Like sometimes we think that there's nothing wrong with being gender neutral, but there are instances when being gender neutral actually ignores an existing problem. Like I'll just share a narrative which, yeah, I experienced personally with a conversation with someone from the department. I don't know if I should share the story. No names. I don't even remember who I was talking to, but right to my face, someone told me that there's no gender discrimination in the department. And because we don't look at each other like using the lens of gender. Um, I think um, I think the person didn't have any intention to offend and was just honestly stating um, that we don't that the department is like sensitive, gender sensitive or whatever. But in at the back of my head, I was thinking that's exactly the problem, because we try to, in our effort to be gender neutral, we actually end up ignoring certain nuances which in the first place we should also take into consideration. Like for example, how Habermas theorized his theory, and now Fraser is pointing out that that's the problem, because you were thinking you were objective, you were gender neutral, but in the process of doing that, you were actually ignoring an existing problem. I don't know. That's just like my take on what Fraser is doing here, and like how I thought of it from my own perspective and from my own experience. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Doc.
Darlene, if you cannot reveal the name of the person, can you reveal the gender?
Obviously.
Gender neutral.
Isa siyang seahorse.
Yes.
Andyan.
Yes po, Doc.
Nagtaas ako ng kamay.
Apo, sige po.
Nakita mo yung comment ko.
Itago natin sa pangalang.
Hindi, yun yung I was trying to pangalan nito follow yung sinasabi ni Ma'am Darlene kanina. Anyway, yung sa akin, yung my comment on this, kasi yung binasa naman ni Chris towards the end na to. I just would like to go back to what Sir Pao said a while ago, yung on one hand, Fraser was parang yun nga yung trying to pierce the Kantian bubble of Habermas. Pero sabi nga ni Sir Pao, Fraser might realize this or might not realize this, but she was coming from also the same or similar Kantian position. At towards the end, mukhang na-affirm yung sinasabi ni Sir Pao kasi towards the end of the essay, it appears na Fraser is para bang laying down the conditions of possibility of an alternative feminist theory by engaging Habermas, no? By pointing out exactly what Habermas missed or what Habermas might have misperceived or Habermas might have misinterpreted. And yun nga, pinapakita niya na how else should we understand not just Habermas, but also feminist theory, or in fact, the very identity of women. And if only for that, marami ako natutunan dito sa essay and from Fraser herself. Maraming elements and parts yung essay na talagang I can say na eye-opener. Katulad nga yung sinabi ni Darlene a while ago, yung by resorting to so-called gender neutrality is not really a way of solving the problem. It's just one way of either ignoring or treating, hindi lang ignoring yung dismissing it as a problem, which will make the whole situation worse. Yun lang ang aking pahabol, Anton.
Salamat po, Doc. I just called Doc Pao po for the last time, tapos I'll just say something.
Yeah,
to emphasize.
pahabol lang, but it is more of it's more of a question for Darlene, since she mentioned gender neutrality. I just want to ask her to clarify exactly what she means by gender equality. But I understand yung gender neutrality. Sorry, gender equality, gender neutrality. But I understand the context of ignoring the fact that there are that even within our department there are issues related to gender roles, and maybe even things that baka we don't just don't talk about it, pero baka may mga problema din tayo hindi na pag-uusapan, no? Pero I understand that point. Pero yung but more specifically on gender neutrality, is it possible pagka gender neutrality, is that what it means, Darlene? Yung parang we just accept that, there's no problem with regard to gender in a specific workplace. and yeah, yun ang clarification. Just want to clarify. But the second thing that I want to ask you is regarding your position on uh, the proliferation now of gender. No, if you know what I'm saying, what is your position on that? Of course, we have classically we have the male and female, pero the fact that today people can actually choose their gender, that an individual can actually choose a gender, I don't know, out of political reasons uh, 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 or whatever reason. Pero what is your take on that? I'm asking because one of our colleagues din, si Jennifer, is writing a dissertation on Judith Butler in recognition theory, no, Honnet, and I'm his advisor. And one of her arguments is uh, uh, na masyadong I don't know how to phrase it exactly. But basically, what she's trying to say is that uh, uh, I am a female attracted to the same gender. I'm attracted to another female, but I don't want to be called this or that. I don't want to be categorized as A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You know, parang siya sabi ni Jennifer. And I seem to understand I seem to understand her point. And ang sinasabi niya, I'm a woman, no? Uh, but I'm attracted to another woman, and I don't want to be categorized kasi that yung further categorization for her becomes another form of parang it feeds the tendency to uh, I call reify gender, despite the fact and ironically, even if you introduce more gender types, but there's a tendency to reify these gender types, and it becomes ideological in the long run. So I'd just like to get to hear your opinion of that.
Sige.
I
Doc,
Thank you, Sir Pao. Putting me on a hot spot. I don't know. So the first question, I was just borrowing Fraser's word here, like when she talked about gender neutral reification, and I was talking about instances when we refuse to recognize that there's a difference between men and women, and that there are differences in terms of, you know, emotional, physical, spiritual, whatever state. Parang gender neutrality is when we don't go into those differences, and we don't take into consideration those differences. So that's what I meant by gender
Yeah. So
neutrality.
you're looking at it from a more or less philosophical standpoint, no? When we don't problematize and we don't distinguish, or we don't I call this, we don't recognize complexities or nuances, no? Parang
Yeah.
just want to totally ignore that there's a problem.
Yes, sir. That's what I meant by gender neutrality. And in theory, I mean, in philosophical theories, we know how what this kind of attitude, what problems this kind of attitude has created. And it's good that parang um ngayon meron ng mga bagong lumalabas na writers, for example, female writers who talk about things that we usually didn't talk about before, or parang more women are encouraged to speak up and say what they think, and how they feel, for example, in the workplace or in any other settings, because I personally think that it's something that we need to take into consideration, both in real life and in theories. And then just the second question, what's my take on the emergence of different kinds of gender? I don't know what to say about it because I think gender identity is a very personal thing. Like, I think it's a personal experience. I mean, if Jennifer doesn't want to be identified in existing genders, I would call herself or not call herself, but she can be called like someone who's gender fluid or ungendered, or I don't know. Uh,
Yeah,
so
I think the problem she has is precisely yung naming part, no? Yung
mm,
categorization part. I mean,
mm,
maybe one person can enjoy, I mean, in terms of sexuality, for example, one person can enjoy different levels of sexuality, let's put it that way. But it's different when uh, yung extra level of legitimation is required for a
mm.
person to enjoy those levels of sexuality. So parang yun ang nakikita kong argument ni Jennifer.
If I think para I haven't really like read a lot about these things. Sabi ko nga parang I'm just new. Sa feminism pa nga lang, I'm new. So parang I don't know what I don't have anything specific to say about that, but it can be like her thesis to create, should we say category, or to create that for herself. I don't know whatever that
Hmm.
is.
Kasi I think last na lang Anton, I think she doesn't mention it or she didn't mention it. But I think it's related to what yung sinabi ni Georg Müller, yung prophilicity, no? At the end kasi it's all about profiling and she doesn't want to be profiled or put under a profile that she is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, parang ganun. So, I mean, I think even if one is sexually fluid, no, the need to be profiled, no, under these categories is another form of ideological. I don't know how to call it. It becomes another form of ideology, another form of reification, and of course, the one being reified might also feel oppressed or repressed. Parang ganun. So sa tingin ko yun ang that's how I interpret Jennifer's thesis.
Okay, thank you for that brief but very substantial exchange. Yeah, I think also, I mean, just to wrap everything up, that's one of the points of Nancy Fraser, the tendency of Habermas's like, meta narrative, so to speak, or meta theory, to become ideological at times by simply, as Nancy Fraser would do, by simply failing to substantiate the plight of the feminine or the importance of that feminine role within the system. And so, oh, this is not the.
Nag-raise yata ng
And
hand si Aldrin. Aldrin, did you raise your hand?
Ay, yes sir. Ano po, tawag dito, mag-comment lang po ako sana kaso medyo magulo po kasi yung nabuo ko pong idea regarding dun sa nabanggit niya po kay Ma'am OJ po regarding dun sa stance niya po regarding gender. Kasi parang nakaka-confuse po rin po yun kasi po parang may tendency din po na magkaroon po ng erasure pagdating po dun sa profiling kasi parang hindi ko po sure kung ano po yung pinaka-stance po ni Ma'am OJ as a whole. Pero parang napag-usapan din po kasi namin in a separate or ng ilang ko pong friends in a separate group po na there's also a problem din po sa normative battle po ng individual labels in their attempt to find recognition when it comes to them avoiding particular injustices individually. So parang kasi po as a gender fluid person, naiintindihan ko po yung kasi parehas po kami ni Ma'am Moji regarding po dun sa stance na I'm still a man, I can fall in love with anyone and I'd rather not prefer labels. Pero parang may stretch pa din po yun kasi yun nga po, yung specific labels, parang hindi naman po sila lumalaban just because they want the labels to be recognized as just as labels or just as profiling things po. Pero parang it's grounded on normative ideas such as we don't want to get hurt, we don't want to be suddenly killed in the middle of nowhere just because we are expressing this particular kind of sexuality or expressing this kind of gender stance in particular. So parang ganun lang po yung working comment ko po na medyo magulo. Pasensya na po.
Yeah, thank you for that, Aldrin. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that was a, binaba kasi ni Adrian, binaba mo agad yung kamay mo. I thought you just pressed it by accident.
Okay lang po. Sorry.
Right, fine. Yeah, but I mean, let me just to read this last line. What we need instead is a framework capable of foregrounding the evil of dominant subordination. I mean that ideological tendency that perhaps our own mental operations, our own mental frameworks operate in. What's important, and this is like a major takeaway that I would say we get from Fraser's essay here, is the tendency of already like theory being fixed, or perhaps our ideas being fixed. There's always that possibility of critique once again. The emancipatory potential really is something alive that we must pay attention to. So with that, we end this evening's Noche session. Thank you very much for your participation, especially Jim and Claire's insights, as because they were assigned to participate. And for everybody, I hope that we would see each other again in our next Noche session. It's supposed to be the end of this month, but I think it's better if we move it to the following week because it's just too short. But anyway, we'll send another email about that. So thank you po again, and I hope to see you soon. Take care po.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you po.
Thank you po.
Thank you po.